So, hi everyone. I'm here with Rob Tyler today. Rob, welcome back. And Rob obviously works for Nemosis, who's in the sort of the management coaching and behavioural change kind of field. And we were chatting, Rob. We were chatting around a little bit recently, I suppose, around all the changes that are going on in the economy. And I thought it'd be good just to touch base in terms of what that means from our behaviours and for our management teams as well. And as we were sort of chatting a bit about that, so I thought it'd be a good sort of topic for us to maybe go through and quite appropriate at the start of the year. So, how are you sort of finding things as we sort of kick into this year? I mean, you sensing there's a lot of worry around how the year's going to play out?
Well, first of all, thanks, Chris. It's good to be back. Yeah, it's an interesting question because if you'd asked me that question a week ago, I would say that we were still in a period of somewhat uncertainty and skepticism. But actually, from a perspective of the economy, things seem to have changed quite a bit in the last week.
Yeah.
And there does seem to have been a sudden increase in optimism.
Yeah.
I mean, I noticed that the stock markets have gone up. I think this morning they were trading above 7,800 in the UK, which is pleasing to see, of course. But it's also indicative of the optimism that's being created.
Yeah.
But I think from my perspective, what's really important, and it's good that we're doing this in January, because January is obviously a beginning.
Yeah.
And people in management, I think, will experience a number of endings and beginnings in different environments, the economy being just one of them. And it's important, I think, to acknowledge that life is a series of endings and beginnings. And those endings and beginnings can either run concurrently or sequentially, but they're no doubt there. So going back to your comment about the environment, from a management perspective, how well we manage our cycles, if you like, of whatever experience we're having that started and at some point will finish, in some respects defines our overall experience.
And so we have different endings and startings throughout our life, don't we? And I suppose you have different aspects of that. So I mean, I was thinking principally around the employment market as well. So we might have turmoil in that because that comes economically, but you have all these other endings and beginnings as well, such as almost like from a life point of view in terms of like be it sort of like family, be it it's like personal relationships, all of those kind of things can be sort of endings and beginnings.
Life is indeed. I mean, life is a series of endings and beginnings. Multiply. So I think what's important is to acknowledge that first of all, and having acknowledged that, and accepting that whatever experience we're going through had a beginning and will have an end, it puts us in a better position, I think, to manage those cycles, preempt them, and create a certain smoothness, if you like, to the transitions that we face.
Does that change, I suppose, whether it's because you can have good changes and bad changes as well, right? So sometimes these beginnings and endings can be a good thing, and so sometimes they're not a great thing as well. I mean, how do we need to think about that? Do we need to sort of extend the good ones or versus the bad ones, or is it just like how do we change our approach to it depending on what it might be and how we might feel about it?
Yeah, it's a good point. So I think a good thing to acknowledge is, and I'm not the first person to say this, but a beginning and an ending is the same place. You can't have a beginning unless you have an ending. So in order to make a fresh start, if you like, you do have to acknowledge that something has come to an end, and it could be a job, it could be a relationship, a reporting relationship, whatever it happens to be in the workplace. But to acknowledge that up front gives you an opportunity then to create the new beginning for yourself. And you mentioned about, it could be good or bad. Well, that's true. But again, I think that depends on how you define it, and depends on your own perspective. And this is where language, I think, comes into play. And I hear a lot about endings, if you like, being cast as endings, which makes it sound a bit doom and gloom. But you can also look upon it as, for example, a completion. The end of a planned outcome, however you wish to define it. So if we acknowledge that our cycles have a start and a finish, the completion of that cycle can be looked at in a very positive light. Looking back on it, what did it bring you? What did you achieve from that? And it might have been an unpleasant experience, but just because it was an unpleasant experience doesn't mean to say it wasn't an opportunity for growth and understanding and increased self-awareness, which incrementally can improve your overall capabilities. So the perspective you take around your various cycles of endings and beginnings, I think, is an important one. And it certainly doesn't need to be seen as something which is bad just because it's finished. It's an acknowledgement that that cycle was always going to finish at some point, and therefore, what did I gain from that?
Yeah, and I suppose you get into this sort of like, you can be disappointed if something good's come to an end, or it hasn't quite finished the way you want to, and you can become very focused on the ending piece instead of focusing actually on the beginning piece, right? So it's like, well, how do I actually think about, well, what does that mean going forward, rather than necessarily looking back and sort of living in the past in terms of like, how do you, I mean, that's a frame of reference thing, is it not?
It is, yeah. I mean, the endings and beginnings are often our emotional high points, aren't they? So it depends on what emotions we attach as the event occurs. But one thing that's worth observing is that sometimes that there's been an ending and beginning. I mean, it's very clear. If you go on holiday and come home, it started and it's finished.
Yeah.
We know that the festive season's over. It's very clear. But there are other situations, I think, that are much more vague and much more difficult to manage. And so, for example, your relationships with individuals, wherever they might be, acknowledging maybe where you are in that cycle. Have they actually finished without you realizing, or are you still kind of clinging on, if you like? Are there things that you need to do to kickstart and maybe get onto a new cycle? Some of these can be very vague. I mean, even competency and proficiency, which is probably going to come to the fore in the workplace. Where are you in your cycle of proficiency? Are you still the person that you used to be in terms of your skills and capabilities and even your interest in what you do? Or have you moved on? And is it worth acknowledging that there has been that change, and it is good time now maybe to complete that cycle and move on to something different?
I suppose part of it sounds like, I've got to recognize, when there's the change going on. I suppose there's some skill around that in terms of like, well, thinking about it, but then also, how do we sort of like think about tools or techniques around our change of reference in terms of frames of reference, in terms of like how we then relate to that change as well? I mean, how should we think about that? And almost like, to make the change easier? Is it to make it better outcomes? Is it or is it, how does that kind of help us, and what can we do about it? So if that's a fundamental sort of influence on how we interact with the change.
Yeah, so I think that's a good point. And having a frame of reference and having a mental picture of where you are within your various experience cycles, I think, is a good starting point. So it's also worth remembering that some of the change is going to be caused by external factors, and some might be caused by yourself, and they're probably going to be different experiences. So if a completion, if you like, and I'm going to call it a completion rather than an end, of an experience cycle is imposed externally, that might come as a bit of a shock. And then change is suddenly thrust upon you. So you're then in a situation where you've got to decide how you react to that. What is your mindset around enforced change? So you can look upon it as something bad, or you can look upon it as something that was always going to happen. Have an acceptance of it. Look upon it maybe as an opportunity for a new experience, and also look upon it as look retrospectively at what you've done and examine the growth that came from that, that got you to the point you are now, which enables you then to move on to maybe a different or even greater experience.
Yeah.
So endings, if you like, or completions, as I like to call them, don't necessarily signal bad news. They can create a massive opportunity for you to take what you've learned and then move on to something which is, even though you might not see it at the time, could be something which is better than you just experienced. That's the first thing, which is the external influence, if you like, on as the catalyst for the change. The other thing, which I think is also very important, particularly for people in the workplace, is your internal position. And what I see actually as a coach is probably not a great deal of clarity as to where an individual might be in their career cycle or even their role cycle. So the danger, I think, is if you think of it in terms of the optimal amount of time that you spend in a particular role or doing a particular task that has a sweet spot for change. The task is knowing where you are in that cycle, and knowing when you have reached the point, if you like, where it's probably not going to improve, and being prepared then to accept that and transition onto the next level or the next role. Or it could be anything. It could be a change of role. It could even be retirement. It could be whatever the individual thinks is best for them. So, again, you have to have a perspective around where you are in your own individual cycle in terms of your career. The pitfalls of not having good perspective is that you might make changes too often and therefore not realize the benefits of the role that you're in. Or you may not make the change soon enough and stay around too long. And then you start to experience some negative effects. When probably, if you're honest, you know that you probably should have done something by now. But there's another bit of you, maybe a little bit of procrastination that says, I'm just going to stick around as long as I can. But of course, sticking around as long as you can may be of detriment, and it may use up the time that you could be taking to pursue something new and exciting.
I'm sort of thinking there about how easy it is to advise friends or colleagues about what they should do. But so you can say, well, you should do this is the logical thing to do, and you sort of got it all mapped out as almost like it's this external third party. And then the same situation can come up for you personally in sort of like 3 weeks time, and you'd make exactly the same decision that you're advising against, because it's about you. I mean, how do you sort of get that external perspective? And even though it might be the right thing, it can be very hard to go against it and create that external perspective when you're sort of in the thick of it, right? I mean, how do you sort of extract yourself from the situation and say, look, as a third party, this is what it seems like the most logical thing to do, and this is what I would advise my friend to do, but I've got to give myself the advice, if you sort of mean.
Yeah. It's a very good question, and within that, there are lots and lots of complex layers of human behavior.
Yeah.
But I think what is important is self-awareness. So you first of all have to say to yourself, what is my level of self-awareness? Is my self-awareness governed purely on what I think about myself? Or am I taking valuable input from everybody around me? Are my thoughts being validated? Is what I'm thinking actually true?
Yeah.
Am I putting self-limitations in the way? Would other people say things about me that I wouldn't say about myself? Do I have skills that I don't recognize but other people believe are inherent? So I think the answer to your question really is to communicate, and do it in a way that is balanced, that you're prepared to take whatever people say to you, and also use sources of the inputs that you find reliable. So you may just want to work with one or two trusted companions and people who will give you good, honest feedback in a very non-judgmental way, so that you can extract some value from that, and then really, having increased your self-awareness, you're in a much better position then to be able to really think about you as the person in your new environment, and how you can position yourself most adeptly, if you like, for the future ahead of you.
I suppose that finding those trusted people is quite important, just in terms of, because if you go into people who, I mean, people can have political agendas and all those kind of things.
Sure.
I mean, you get some of those things as well, which is, so you want to try and have people who are going to give you the honest feedback rather than, a varnished version of that in terms of like, oh, you're wonderful or whatever it is. It's really about finding that real friend, isn't it? To say, well, actually, you should be doing this. As a friend, I would do that, and you have to sort of go back and say, well, challenge them. Well, maybe I should be doing that. I don't know. So that trust element must come up as being quite important, I would think.
It is, yeah. You certainly don't want any sort of underlying agenda or conditionality around the conversation. So, but it's a personal choice, and we all know the people that we could, best speak to, and others that may be less able to give you the input you're looking for.
And I suppose everyone else is going through the same thing as well. That's the other thing. So is there not a bit around honesty as well, right? In terms of, we all like to think we're very different, but a lot of us are actually, very, very similar in many ways in terms of, human psychology is common amongst all of us, right? So I imagine there's a little bit of that, even though it might be hidden and other people might not have that perspective or that sort of like, external perspective or self-awareness, but even if you do, right? So I mean, that I suppose is in the mix as well.
It is, yeah. I mean, fundamentally, behavior is quite common. It's like it's a little bit like a set of pistons, insofar as, for some people there are issues that are in play and others that aren't, and vice versa. So, but I think it's down to the individual to work out for themselves, I think, how it's best to get that input. And I know it's difficult in the workplace because, not everyone is willing to share their true thoughts and feelings about the situation they're in. So you could look to sort of independent people. I mean, without wishing to bang on about my own profession, having an external input as a coach, for example, or something equivalent, doesn't have to be a coach, is often a very useful way of being able to table your true, your honest feelings about the situation, to get that neutral and independent input. Although one thing I would stress is that you should always be the person that makes your own decisions and not expect other people to do it for you.
Yeah. And I suppose, what's the intersection between, I suppose, endings, beginnings, I suppose, self-awareness, but then also there's a lot talked about imposter syndrome. That's been quite a popular topic over the last couple of years as well. And what's the interaction between that? Because it feels like there's a bit of sort of like self-awareness, which sort of starts, but then you can sort of get into that overlay with other psychological things around, well, am I doing a good job, and sort of those insecurities as well. But then that's also having the self-awareness might sort of create some of those things, but if you get through it, it's probably a good thing, because then you say, well, actually, I am looking at the evidence as an example. You actually got evidence that actually you are doing a good job, and that's one of the things I imagine you could probably do. I mean, is there? I mean, everything's kind of interrelated. I kind of know, but
very much so.
How do you think about that in terms of almost like the change and the endings and the beginnings piece as well, in terms of like what our own voice is saying internally as well?
Well, you're right. It's very systemic. It's very sort of interconnected, and complex in many respects. But if you look at a situation, let's start with self-awareness. So fundamentally, as I just discussed, self-awareness is best positioned by as much input as you can get, both internally and externally. So you get a very rounded set of opinions as to you as a person, if you like, in the current environment or the future environment that you see yourself going towards. Once you've got good self-awareness and clarity, you're going to make better choices about how you position yourself moving forward. So which environment's going to work for you. So you mentioned or touched on psychological positioning, which might get in the way of that. I mean, imposter syndrome being one of them, or self-imposed barriers is another. So I think if you look at those, they are things that we bring upon ourselves largely.
Mm.
I doubt whether somebody you're working with is going to come along and say, "Oh, by the way, I think you've got an imposter syndrome going on." So this is something that is felt within, um, and of course, it's there because maybe you don't have sufficient input from the outside. And if your imposter syndrome is, well, I can't, and I've heard this, I can't believe that I'm doing the job that I'm doing.
Yeah.
Surely I'm going to get found out at some point. How did I ever make it to this point without anyone noticing?
Yeah.
Those sort of comments. But they're the sort of things you might say to yourself. However, unless you get input from other people, and by the way, someone at some point did make a decision that you should do the role that you're doing.
Yeah.
Unless you get those inputs, you're never really going to be able to test your own perceptions or self-perceptions to the extent where you validate whether they're true or not.
How much do you think the media, and particularly social media, plays into our perceptions of ourselves and our self-awareness, and even as it links back to beginnings and endings, in terms of like what should be a good ending, what should be a good beginning, what should you get from things? I mean, it's like we have this almost like external narrative going on around what things should be, and a lot of the time it might be fiction that you're actually seeing on TV that's done to entertain, right? It's entertainment that's actually been done, but it does subconsciously sort of pervade your thoughts in terms of like, well, this is what a good life should be, or this is what a good employee should be, or those sort of things. But and the data might show it's actually something different than what you see on TV, as an example, or on social media. I mean, how much of a problem do you think that's sort of building to be?
It can be problematic. I think that's well publicized. That there certainly have some issues regarding self-perception and social media. So I think the starting point for that is to, if you're engaging with social media, you have got to ask yourself, what thoughts and feelings is that creating within you? Because if you're taking information in from social media, you're going to get a thought and it's going to create a feeling within you. And that feeling is going to make you feel probably something about yourself in relation to what you're seeing in response to the question that you posed. So I think firstly, you have to validate the accuracy, if you like, perspective and completeness of the information you're taking in the first place. Because it is very easy for that information to be skewed, and you can create a false impression, if you like, of what's really going on out there. Because it's, in a sense, it can be a kind of positive news bias. You're only seeing the good stuff, and then you're comparing that to you and thinking, well, everybody else seems to be having a great life. What's happened to me?
But I suppose from your point of view, what you're saying is the evidence might show that is actually not the case, right?
Exactly.
If you actually look at it, but it's just what you perceive because you're, social media or TV. I mean, the one that always gets me is, I mean, I have to say that I do not have a bath every night with lots of candles, drinking red wine. I can't think of anything worse than drinking red wine in a hot bath.
Wow.
But
I'm very disappointed in you, Chris.
but it's on TV a lot, right? Because it's a literary tool to say relaxing, right? So, and it's used on TV and it looks very nice, but it's not something that I would personally do, right? Some people might do it and they might enjoy it, but it colors around what you think might be a good thing to do in the evening, right? But it's not necessarily what people necessarily do, right?
That's right. Yeah. So in a sense, going back to the inputs that you allow to create those kind of thoughts and feelings, you're getting down to sort of information availability bias. Are you being conditioned by the availability of the information that you're taking in? Because if you had absolute full information, your perspective would probably be a little bit different, and you'd realize that most of the population, including yourself, it would sound, does not sit in a bath with champagne and candles. So that's it is important. And the other thing I think is and interesting perspective I heard recently is how the use of social media pushes people much faster towards the level of a self-esteem.
Mm.
We've all heard of, Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
Mm.
But there seems to be an acceleration towards needing to get to those greater levels of self-esteem, probably faster than is natural. You're almost jumping straight to I've got to have everyone think I'm great, or I've got to try and keep up with everybody else in some respects.
And I suppose coming back to the beginnings and endings piece is, does that, if you don't have that self-awareness, does it force you internally into more beginnings, more endings and more beginnings quicker than maybe you need to? Maybe it needs to be a little bit longer. And so I'm hearing sort of like, how do you take a step back and also have that self-control to be able to control your narrative, to control those cycles to a certain extent, some of which are externally imposed, but I mean to a greater extent, and then how you interrelate with it.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So I mentioned earlier on about, if you're in a career cycle, for example, it's finding the sweet spot where making a shift, making a change is optimal, and the dangers, if you like, of acting before you reach that sweet spot, and not realizing the full benefits of the position you might be in. And of course, to get to that point, you might be encouraged by misinformation. Seeing people who are apparently doing a lot better than you through social media. The inputs are skewed, but you're influenced then to then go and take an action because you feel that your perspective is that you're falling behind when actually you're not.
Yeah.
So I think the takeaway from this is really all about just being in control of your own knowledge of your own positioning in your own career cycles, and making sure that the information inputs that you're getting are full and accurate, and along with that, comprehensive, and believable as well to some extent.
Well, I'm all for getting more data. As you know me, I do like a bit of data, but it does seem like there's a lot of misinformation around potentially just in our environment, right? And it's like, how do we sort of step back and be honest with ourselves and get the data from trusted people, right, as well? So so I think that's it's very good advice. And there's been a lot of change over the last couple of years, haven't there? I mean, I suppose it's it does look like there might be more. I mean, hopefully it's going to be, we can be optimistic that it's actually going to get better this year. So I hope that a lot of the forecasts have seen, frankly, I think a lot of us hope that they're wrong. So and things get better, really. So so we start the year optimistically.
Well, we never know. We never know. But I think the point is that if we acknowledge, just going back to our starting point, if we acknowledge that we are in cycles of beginnings and completions all the time, if we acknowledge that up front, then we're in a much better position to be able to control our outcomes. Because we know we'll focus more on where we are in our individual cycles, and the various inputs that are creating self-impressions. And then we'll be in a much more solid position to make the right decisions about what's right for us going forward in a series of changing environments, because it's always yourself in an environment. That is the sort of, the going in position, if you like. It's always yourself in the environment in which you find yourself.
I'm pretty sure you said to me before, I know you've said to me before, it's like, if you're in a tough situation now, I mean, the knowledge that it is a cycle and you will get through it because cycles go round is actually pretty reassuring, right? So things seem pretty tough, but it is a cycle, and there will be an end to that goes on, and there'll be a new beginning that kind of happens as well, just by definition, won't there? So
absolutely.
So I mean, that's, in some ways, that's quite reassuring to know that it's a cycle, rather than as much as anything, just thinking about it almost like as a circle, to a certain extent.
And change is constant. And the reason that change is constant is because we are going to be moving through various cycles, as I said, either sequentially or simultaneously. So that is going to happen. But that is what makes up life's experience. It's the combination of those various cycles that creates our overall life experience. And if you're in a situation where you can manage those much more skillfully, one would hope that your overall experience would increase.
Yeah. Well, as ever, it's always interesting to chat to you, Rob, and I appreciate my personal public coaching session. Again, and although I share too much about my bath time habits, maybe, but
well, we can talk about that on another day, maybe.
but I do appreciate it, and I know it can get tough out there, but I think this whole concept around endings being beginnings and the cycle, and just being honest with yourself and getting honest data, I think is quite important, and clearly it can be important for all of us. So
it is, and be optimistic as well.
Yeah. So Rob, thanks very much appreciate it.
Thanks, Chris. Nice to speak to you again.
Thanks.
All the best.